There's a ton of questions, and it was hard grouping them, but I tried to give different kinds of subjects. The first one has to do with wearables, the famous Apple Watch. It says the Apple Watch represents pretty slick wearables technology, health and wellness apps. How robust is the innovation in this wearables market, and what might we see in the future? And a related question had to do with implants that actually are implanted in your body, again, as a health monitor. And so again, what is the future in the world of implants? So those two.
Well, I think as most of you know, wearables are a sort of hot buzzword in Silicon Valley these days. There's a lot of venture capital funding going into startups of one kind or another. Fitbit just went public, which was a huge success, and so on. And this is all possible, of course, because of the miniaturization of electronics and the fact that they're getting smaller and smaller. And so it's now plausible to put something inside of, that's probably more powerful than a smartphone even 5 years ago in your wristwatch. I think the bigger question, and what we've been thinking about, is how many compelling applications are there for these watches that would cause all of you to want to have one. And prior to the Apple iWatch, I think our view was not so many. And so we passed on a lot of things. And I don't yet own an iWatch. At my now advanced age of 50, I look for things that are very easily visible. But in fact, all my watches of 10 years ago are too small and too hard to read, so I've gotten new watches. My daughter's teased me about, why are you always getting new watches, Dad? Well, I can read them. Anyway, the iWatch has caught on, I think, with a lot of success, and some of the people I know who have them do find real value in being able to link, what's happening on your smartphone to your watch and be able to get a message or have it vibrate when you have a new message of one kind or another. So I think they're likely to be, something that's very popular in the next few years. As it relates to implantable technology, of which there are many kinds already, for keeping track of your heart and things like that. I think that's another very interesting field. We have one company that we invested in, I want to say 18 years ago. This is what it's like to invest in medical technology. It's now called Senseonics, if memory serves me correctly. And my partner, Jim Barrett, was the initial founding CEO of this company. The idea behind it is to have something about the size of a grain of rice under the skin of your arm, which can monitor your glucose. And then you have a watch-like thing that you wear just on top of it, and the watch subcutaneously can read out whatever's in the little rice-sized sensor. That technology has taken, I want to say, 18 years to get right. It's finally working and working well, which is super exciting because for diabetes patients, it's totally game-changing. If you just think about the challenge of monitoring your insulin, if every time to do it you have to prick your finger, you're just not going to get accurate readings. And so I think there will be some really, really significant medical benefits that come from some of these implantable devices.
Good. There were a number of questions on the subject of immigration. And if you were here for Matthew Slaughter's address, the dean of Tuck School, you remember he mentioned this same problem. One of the best students at Tuck this year graduating came into his office in tears because he's a foreign student and he had not been in the lottery to get a H-1B visa. And he was furthermore told that he has to get out of the country in 60 days. That was the time he was told. And I did a little research since then, and I learned that last year there were 250,000 applications for 85,000 positions and visas. The rest of the people were basically told that they had to leave. So the questions that you've raised had to do with mainly what are you doing, or is your industry doing, with Congress to get some of these laws changed so that we can tap into this fertile talent pool?
Well, John, as you know, I've been very involved in the patent reform legislation the last few months. And that's legislation which we can talk about if you want, but there are people who on both sides disagree about what to do, which I think is understandable. But when it comes to immigration reform, there is no one in Silicon Valley who is not very strongly in favor of immigration reform that would bring highly talented people into the country. It's unfortunately been caught up with a political tussle between the Republicans and Democrats, both of whom agree that the policy of, say, stapling a green card to the back of any reasonable diploma would be a good idea, creating visas for people who come here to start companies and are able to attract funding for them, that sort of thing. Everybody on both sides of the aisle agrees with that. The problem is that the Democrats, of which I am one, I'm a moderate Democrat, if that helps you in calibrating my remarks at all, but the Democrats would like to couple that kind of immigration with more comprehensive immigration reform and are only willing to move forward with the former if they get the latter. And the Republicans say, no, we don't agree with what you want to do over there, so we just want to focus on this. And that has created a stalemate for at least 5 years.
Wow. There's other questions which really have to do with the business that he's in which one question said, you often must see companies with no revenue or profit record, inventors or innovators with absolutely no business experience. What are you looking for? And a corollary question is, what motivates innovators? Is it the money? Is it the fame? Is it creating just curiosity? So,
well, let's start with that, John, because actually I think that's really important in terms of evaluating entrepreneurs or prospective entrepreneurs. Our experience is the entrepreneurs who are in it for the money are not the ones who are going to succeed. The ones that are going to succeed are the ones who are in it because they have an insight and a real passion for starting a company and making something of it. And that's important because if they don't have that passion, they're not going to make it. Starting a company is just way too hard. And so we look for people who have a track record of success in their life, no matter where they came from. It's not necessarily about degrees or many of the formulaic ways in which resumes are evaluated. And I generally speaking only ask one question in interviews. I just ask people, how did you get to this room on this day? You know, what happened to you along the way that made you who you are? And tell me where you want to go in the next 10 years. And then I leave them an hour to answer the question. And having done that thousands of times now, I can tell you that it becomes readily apparent who is on a path to really changing the world.
Okay, and then what you look for, that's the kind of thing you're looking for.
That's what we look for in terms of the entrepreneurs. In terms of companies themselves and technologies, for better or worse in our business, we're a very large firm. Our funds are $2.5 billion in size, and consequently, and we have a limited number of people, so we invested in about 100 companies in a given fund, and necessarily we need to have some really big outcomes to make those funds work. So we are strongly biased towards investing in things which can be really big. That's not to say that there aren't lots and lots of really attractive opportunities for investment and company formation that just don't fit that model. So in terms of what we look for, I always start with, is this something that can I imagine this being a multi-billion-dollar revenue enterprise? And if the answer to that is yes, then we keep exploring and trying to understand whether what they have is actually able to change the game that they're looking to change. And to me, the single most important thing to think about is simply the value proposition. What does this new product or service do for the user? Is it so compelling that there are just no chances that they won't want to try it? Or is it kind of a nice to have? Because if it's a nice to have, the risk of trying something new isn't compelling. But if it's going to change your life, you're going to put up with a lot of the foibles that are always a part of new products and inventions.
We have obviously a group that is interested in investing because a number of questions said, how can I invest in all this potential profit for my grandchildren? And are there or should there be venture capital funds that invest in the areas you describe that I'd like to invest in?
Well, investing directly in venture capital firms is not an easy thing to do, unfortunately. from an individual standpoint, simply because the venture firms themselves raise funds every 3 years, and they want to have a relatively small number of people to deal with as investors. So in our case, there are maybe 100 to 200 investors, and they're institutional. Some of them very large, and that's just easier to manage because they write a $100 million check or a $200 million check, and we can count on them to do that, every 3 years because it's part of a $100 billion portfolio or something. So it's a little bit difficult. I mentioned a little bit earlier in my talk, Angel List, Naval Ravikant's thing. There is now a significant movement to make it possible for individuals to invest directly in startups through various mechanisms like that, and I think that's something worth exploring. We'll see if we get automated like everybody else.
Apparently, a number of you subscribe to The Economist magazine because you referred to The Economist in the current edition that apparently says that the patent system and the regulatory environment globally are blocks to innovation. Do you agree, and is it politically feasible to reform these impediments? And the corollary question was the rise of the patent trolls and the junk patents and that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think there are a lot of legitimate concerns about the state of the patent system today, including some of the behavior of patent trolls. But there are the part of the premise of the Economist piece is questioning whether having any kind of system to protect ideas and intellectual property is worthwhile at all. And I think that's a crazy idea. And I would just reference that 40% or 1/3 of our economy is patent dependent, and 40 million American jobs, and we've done better as an economy than anybody else in the last 100 years by any measure. And without it, I don't think we would have. So I'd be a little careful about the idea of throwing out the patent system. And unfortunately, that's about the net effect of what the current legislation would do. There are two bills in the House. There's a bill in the House, a bill in the Senate, H.R. 9 in the House and S. 1137 in the Senate, which would, each of which in subtle ways would essentially eliminate the patent system. From the standpoint of somebody who files a patent, is granted a patent and would like to be able to protect their intellectual property. And they do this essentially by making it so costly and so time-consuming to defend your patent that you would never actually do it. These bills are being sponsored by very large companies. Google and Cisco are the primary ones, Microsoft, Intel, lots of companies. And these companies actually would rather just not have patents because their advantages in the world are well established, and they're threatened by the next set of startup companies. And so to make it very hard for those small companies to defend themselves is a much more attractive thing to do. They also spend hundreds of millions or billions of dollars a year in licensing fees that would be less, it would be less costly if you didn't have to do that. But the problem is that these bills have been marketed in the name of stopping patent trolls, and they've been marketed very effectively to everyone in Washington, so much so that my Washington-based colleagues tell me that if you land at Reagan International Airport, there are literally billboards about stopping patent trolls. And so let's talk about patent trolls for a second. Patent trolls, for those of you who are not familiar with them, is a term used to describe what are otherwise known as non-practicing entities. These are corporations set up not to operate any individual business, but merely to buy and sell patents, patents that were applied for by the inventors, but then at some point they're no longer using them, so they can sell them to a non-practicing entity who will then in turn go around to all the people who are infringing on that patent and either collect royalties from them directly or sue them if they don't want to pay royalties. And personally, I don't think that's an illegitimate thing to do, but the tactics that some of these organizations use are in many cases very problematic. So for example, they will they will send demand letters to retailers who are selling, let's just say, computer printers that violate somebody's patent. And they will say, you have to cease and desist from what you're doing because you're abusing my patent. And the retailers look at them, well, what is this all about? I have no idea. So there are various things that they do which are problematic. Another one is frivolous lawsuits. So one of the problems with the patent system is that there are, in fact, a lot of patents that have been granted that probably shouldn't have been granted. They weren't really fundamental breakthrough stuff. But nevertheless, some of these patent trolls will buy these relatively invaluable patents, and they'll sue people anyway, hoping that someone will settle instead of going to court. And so in that way, these frivolous lawsuits are, I think, a negative aspect of what's happening today. But there are also ways to deal with that, and it's worth noting that, so one of the provisions of the bill, this is probably more than most people wanted to hear about, but one of the provisions of these bills is fee shifting, mandatory fee shifting, so that the loser in any lawsuit will always pay, thereby sort of doubling the cost and maybe creating an incentive not to put forward a frivolous lawsuit. That makes sense between two well-funded entities. It's sort of logical that that would be the outcome. But between a really small company and a really big company, it becomes a club for the big company to squash the small company. So that's the first thing to consider. But the second thing to consider is that the person who's best equipped to judge whether a lawsuit is in fact frivolous is probably the judge, who can see all the facts. And so just having them be completely prescribed by law that there's always fee shifting to the loser is probably not the best way. And in fact, the Supreme Court has had 2 cases in the last 2 years which have basically set precedent for judges to do just that. And since those cases have been ruled on, the number of frivolous lawsuits has declined precipitously. So we don't need necessarily a new law to stop that particular behavior.
Good. This is a question on employment law policy, and it reads, does not the emergence of Uber suggest employment law should shift towards modular, flexible, contractor-like, and away from the old lifetime employment corporate model?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, John. We are investors in several sharing economy companies, including Uber and another one called Hello Alfred. And Uber, as you know, basically has contract workers who file 1099 tax forms, whereas Alfred has chosen to employ people 100% of the time, and there's a kind of continuum between them. I think, given the amount of noise that I hear about this, it seems to me that there's probably some clarification needed to create more flexible structures, both for employees and employers.
Good. Here's a question that has to do with President Obama touted a company called Solyndra 5 years ago as a prime example of American solar energy innovation and leadership. Then the Chinese solar companies swooped in and took over the U.S. market. Within a year, Solyndra went bankrupt. Did the Chinese have superior technology or simply lower prices? And the corollary question is, what's the future? What interesting developments are going on in the solar industry?
How many days do you have to talk about this topic? Unfortunately, I've had a front row seat at what happened to the U.S. solar industry. I helped to start our alternative investing practice in 2002. We went on to invest in 35 companies, about $500 million, on top of which other investors invested another $2 billion. So about $2.5 billion of capital. And of the 35, probably 3 or 4 are alive today. One has worked out well, O-Power, which is a publicly traded company, and most of the rest have gone out of business. It was not a fun exercise, and the saddest part of the story is that many of them had by far and clearly the best technology. There was not enough of a market for it here. There were not, these technologies needed initially some advantage that they didn't from a market standpoint. So for example, remember we talked about the government as the biggest customer of semiconductors. Well, if the government had bought a lot of solar technology from US startups, we'd probably have a solar industry today. But as a consequence of, and I'll come back to Solyndra because it's important, as a consequence to how this played out, basically there wasn't enough of a market, so all the companies eventually couldn't raise any more money, so they were eventually going out of business. Meanwhile, the Chinese saw this wonderful intellectual property, remember patents, came in and bought up all the IP for nothing. Now, there's a second part of the story, which is what happened in China. In China, as most of you know, the country is internally extremely competitive. And so there were initially some successful Chinese solar companies, and every provincial governor and every city mayor decided that they wanted one too. And so they would raise capital to build their own solar plant. And pretty soon, after better part of a decade, there was something like 20 times the world demand of capacity. So there was a massive oversupply problem. And of course, when that happens, prices plummet. And that's really that's the second piece of what killed the US market. But the result is, and that of course led to tremendous turmoil in the Chinese market. But there were survivors, and some of those survivors will be the world leaders of tomorrow, who now have all the intellectual property that we invented in their hands.
Solyndra, you're going to...
So what happened with Solyndra, the government, the energy department loaned some sizable amount of money to Solyndra. This is a company we actually looked at twice and passed on. And there were lots of very, very credible people involved in it. But we passed on it because we didn't think the technology would work. I mean, it was fundamentally not going to work. But nevertheless, hundreds of millions of dollars went into it, and ultimately it failed. And when it failed, it was used as a criticism of the administration and their use of taxpayer money to lend money to these startups. The consequence of that was that they, of course, they not only stopped lending money to any other company, they pulled all the loans of the existing companies, one of which was one of my portfolio companies called Fisker Automotive, which was a competitor to Tesla and was on the verge of commercializing what I think would have been an extremely successful launch. And it's a long and terrible story, but ultimately the loss of that funding killed the company. And now we have only one electric car company instead of two.
And I remember that an investor in the BD, whatever that company, the Chinese electric car company, one major investor is Warren Buffett.
Bird, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Burke?
The Chinese company is called Bird.
Okay, and it's Warren Buffett who's, and they
in.
tried to buy Warren's stake back recently, and he said, no way, I'm going to continue investing in this. Two questions having to do with kind of the rural and developing countries in the world. On a recent visit to China, we saw thousands of solar panels on the rooftops of huts in rural villages. It turned out when we asked our guide that these were solar water heaters. And people could, for the first time in rural China, as well as the cities, get hot water. Is this an area for high potential use throughout the third world at no damage to the climate? And the follow-up is, is clean energy giving the third world tools to finally provide energy but not create pollution and all that?
So the answer to the first part of the question is there are some really wonderful technologies like the solar heaters you're talking about, which have become cost effective enough to be useful in parts of the world like China, rural China. And of course, most of those parts of the world don't have a grid. And so it's actually possible for something to become useful at a cost point that wouldn't necessarily make sense here. It makes sense where you're connected to the grid. But the challenge for most of these technologies is to be able to get enough volume to drive down the cost curve to the point where they're affordable. So with the exception of some things like that, I think most of them are unlikely to be of great value to the third world unless they've already succeeded at being of significant value to the first world.
This had a question on wind power. It seems that the use of wind power in America gets bogged down by protests against the sight of large wind turbines on ridgetops or along bodies of water. Are we lagging the rest of the world in the use of wind power?
Yes. This is another one of those sad stories, which we had a front row seat at. But the long and the short of it is that China in particular has taken over the wind industry. And it's because they behaved very similar to the way our government did, 80 years ago or so when we were funding, having the defense industries buy up all these technologies. They created a market for things. The government said they would buy solar panels, wind panels, by creating a market and creating lots of cheap funding, they end up owning the market when the cost curves come down, and of course they have the manufacturing prowess to do it well.
Here's a question about thorium. Thorium is regarded as a cleaner, safer nuclear power and in more plentiful supply and so forth. Do you see it as a promising alternative energy source, and what is holding it back?
I know nothing about thorium.
Thorium, okay. But it's a uranium...
Joe, what do we know about thorium? No?
Maybe that's thorium's problem. We don't know anything about it. There's some questions about Stanford and the West Coast. Why is Stanford an incubator of innovative companies to agree that Harvard and MIT are not? What can Harvard and MIT and Dartmouth learn from Stanford?
Well, some of it is a historical accident. I mean, once Silicon Valley kind of got going, it was things built one on the other. And I think it's worth mentioning that as much credit as Stanford gets, Berkeley should get just about as much. Berkeley has been an unbelievable source of innovation as well. But I think among the things Stanford does well that you don't see as much in Eastern universities are encouraging faculty members to start companies. They have a very generous sabbatical program. They have relatively friendly policies for licensing intellectual property developed and funded by the university and oftentimes by government grants, so that professors have little friction between what they do inside the university and then going off and starting a company with relatively lightweight terms of payments back to the university. And then having enough time to actually get the company off the ground without having to give up their academic positions. The two Coursera founders have just gone through this process. One ultimately did give up her tenured position to stay with the company, and the other one went back and is still a faculty member.
Here's a very practical question. With all the brain power of Silicon Valley headquartered in that one spot, why did you locate it on top of the Andreas Fault, and what is the backup plan?
Remember I said it was a historical accident? We actually live about 400 yards from the San Andreas Fault in a town called Portola Valley, which has the interesting distinction. It's a town of about 4,000 people, essentially due west of the Stanford campus. And it has the interesting distinction of being the highest creator of patents per capita of any zip code in the United States. So it's chock full of entrepreneurs and Stanford professors and the like. And they've all chosen to live right on the San Andreas Fault. So I don't know what that says.
There's no backup plan, no.
No, there's no backup plan.
20 years ago, Japan was the perceived tech leader, or at least one of the best. What happened to it, and any parallels to what they are doing now and what China is doing?
What Japan is doing now?
Yeah. Are they still a leader in innovation?
I think they're very good in some areas, but they have been relatively unsuccessful at new innovations that lead to breakthrough company formation. I mean, it's not a particularly entrepreneurial society from what we can tell. There's very little venture capital that goes into Japan, for example. But their manufacturing prowess is still phenomenal. Their ability to take somebody else's innovations and hone them down and make something, really great. And the quality of the products, as we all know, is second to none. So, Japan is an amazing place.
And then someone asked the question, what about India? We haven't had really much discussion about India and innovation.
Yeah, India is a really important question for me personally. We've had an investing practice in India since about 2005, I think, and have a couple of $100 million invested there in a collection of companies and a team on the ground and all the rest. It's been a harder place, believe it or not, than China, despite the fact that it's a democratic country and they have had stock markets, freely tradable stock markets, and all these things that we would, if you just put a checklist of things that you cared about as an investment destination, that India would stack up pretty well. And I think over the long run, India may do extremely well, but it's been historically really, really inhibited by the corrupt practices of the government, which have made it very hard for startups. Its lack of infrastructure is kind of breathtaking for those who haven't traveled there, as compared to China, which with its top-down investment strategy has been able to build, first-class highways and cell phone towers and everything else.
High-speed rail.
Not to mention five-star hotels and wonderful restaurants and whatnot. So they're kind of a tale of two cities, or two countries anyway. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out over the next couple of decades. But my personal view is that, especially with Modi, the new prime minister, taking a sort of business-first approach and changing some policies that needed to be changed, I think they're on a good course.
There were some questions having to do with cybersecurity and cyber attacks by other countries, possibly Russia, China. Getting some of our secrets, some of our information that we've worked hard to develop, and being able to use them immediately, legitimately or not. And the question had to do with how can we protect our innovations and make our companies succeed? And is there any progress going on now that we're in more dialogue with countries like China of getting rid of some of this cyber espionage?
I don't think this is going to stop. This is a very important area of concern to me. We're kind of on the front lines of it in many ways, because we've invested in a lot of companies that are developing technologies, mostly on the defense, well, actually exclusively on the defensive side of this game. But sovereign governments have figured out that you can't really be fingerprinted too well based on the attacks that you make, and you can create a huge amount of damage without ever launching a missile, and you can steal an awful lot of intellectual property without ever funding R&D. So there are way more benefits to this kind of activity than there are costs. And so I think we will see nothing but an escalating arms race of so-called cyber terrorism. And not surprisingly, that has created an industry for people who are trying to prevent better defensive mechanisms. And we funded a bunch of them.
Someone said they heard about Silicon Beach. What is your feeling on this? Do you ever heard of Silicon Beach?
Well, I haven't heard of Silicon Beach, John.
Okay, well, whoever asked the question did. We'll find out. Let's see. What do you think of the movement to do away with tenure in education and making our future teachers have degrees in history, math, etc., instead of in education?
Well, let's talk about tenure first. I actually am a fan of tenure from the standpoint of giving people the freedom to do the kinds of basic research without any purposeful intent at the beginning. As we talked about earlier, it's led to most of the important discoveries and ultimate commercialization of things. So I like the idea of tenure. My father was dean of the Mass Maritime Academy for a few years, and they in addition to tenure had a union, which was a pretty toxic combination. You can talk to him about that afterwards. So I think tenure alone is fine. Unionized faculty I would not find to be a very sensible idea. And importantly, in secondary schools, I think it's where research is not being conducted. I think it's a travesty that we don't have a more competitive labor environment for teachers.
There's a question you raised in your slide about basic research versus applied, or basic patents versus applied patents. And in China, you mentioned they're spending a lot more in R&D. Are we seeing a lot more basic patents being issued to the Chinese versus most other countries in the world?
Well, they're issuing patents like crazy. I don't have a view as to how good their patents are, but I think there's some evidence that they're not that good. But as I said, I think sooner or later they'll get to be very good. It's just a question of when.
People all heard about the devaluation of the Yuan by 2% a couple days ago. Will that have any impact, in your view, on American business or on innovation at all? Or just simply make them more competitive?
I mean, I think it's just more evidence that the Chinese government is concerned about the slowing of their economy, and it's a lever that they have that our government doesn't have, because our currency trades freely against other currencies. But we shouldn't forget that our government has also exercised an incredibly powerful lever that no one else has, which is to print money through quantitative easing over the last however many years. And so you have these two, very powerful governments with lots of big levers that nobody else in the world has. And when they see cause for concern about their own economy, they use them. We can all debate whether it's good or bad. But in terms of the near-term impact, obviously, by devaluing their currency, they make their exports more attractive to the rest of the world. So their economy should be stimulated by that. It makes it more expensive for us to buy Chinese things, so that may have some damping effect on our economy. But 2%, I don't think this is a big deal.
Some people were really curious about Little Israel, and it showed up in your slide as a kind of an R&D play. How'd that happen, and what's going on there?
Israel's an unbelievable nation. I mean, they have virtually no market to themselves, and yet they produce incredible amounts of innovation. Much of it comes to Silicon Valley. They've actually, I alluded to the fact that everybody comes to Silicon Valley to try to figure out how to have one of their own. I would say Israel has done this as well or better than anybody else. And what they've figured out is a kind of hub and spoke model works really well. They create the R&D and they keep the jobs associated with it in Israel, and then they send their entrepreneurs to Silicon Valley when they're ready to commercialize something. They raise venture capital in the Valley. They oftentimes hire professional management in the Valley, and then all the business functions of the company end up being in the Valley. And the first market they pursue is usually the United States.
Here's one of wanting to know a little bit about your role with Thayer School of Engineering, and it is, as a member of the Board of Overseers for Thayer, what role do you play, and how much are you involved, and what impact do you have on the engineering program or curriculum at Thayer?
Well, like I think a board member of any organization, we basically try to advise the CEO, in this case it's Joe Helbley, and give him ideas that we pick up from the various things that we do in our day-to-day life. And he, of course, is smart enough to disregard the ones that don't make any sense, and that's probably most of them. And then we also get to see the amazing things that are happening at their school today. It's really remarkable and very, very exciting.
There's a question regarding the battle of the giants, the Amazon, Apple, Google, Samsung, and Microsoft, and how they each seem to be encroaching on each other's space, and they're competing at a very high level. And the question is, do you see this ending up with one or two of these really having the commanding share of this market, or is there a lot to go around?
Well, it depends which market you're talking about. In the case of the search market, Google has very commanding market share in the United States, something like 80 or 90%, and even more so in Europe. They obviously are not in China. Baidu dominates that market since they left a few years ago. If you're talking about cell phones, Apple, while making a relatively small fraction of the actual handsets themselves, takes away the lion's share of the profits of the entire industry. So you could argue that the consolidation of power is already taken place in those businesses.
Google acquired Nest, the maker of the smart thermostat for the home and now other internet-connected gadgets for the home. Is this likely to become the wave of the future or a passing fancy?
Well, I think these, the simple way to think about it is the technology to create things like Nest is now available. It's cost effective. You can connect things wirelessly. You can have fairly strong amounts of computational power for a couple of dollars that you could stick into a device that you would attach to anything. So that's not, to me, the interesting question. The interesting question is, what do you do with it? And is it of value to do that? So to the extent that a Nest device delivers, back to my earlier thought, a value proposition to consumers that they find meaningful, then Nests will proliferate. Somebody gave me a Nest. I've never really used it, so I haven't been personally compelled by it yet. But to the extent that it really does allow you to save energy by dampening down or raising the temperature of your home and things of that nature, I think those kinds of things will definitely grow grow and become very popular. Importantly, I think these things have to be easy to use. That's one of the biggest, trends in Silicon Valley, is that as more and more of these technologies are tried out on consumers first, the companies that are successful are the ones that have made technology really easy to use. And that has created, by the way, for those of you who are still here at Dartmouth as a student, huge shortfall in people who are specializing in what's called UI or UX, which is user interface design and design functionality. So these are, I personally think that as technology is, the building blocks of technology are cheaper and available to just about anyone. The thing that matters most is figuring out what to do with it and being able to design it and package it in a product that is easy for anyone.
A couple of people want to know why, if this is factual, but why there are so few women in Silicon Valley. Is that true? And could it hamper innovation?
Well, could it hamper innovation? Of course. I mean, how can you expect to have the best result if half the people aren't in the race? And I think it will also be resolved. I think this is a temporal problem in the sense that Silicon Valley has largely been built by engineers, and there haven't historically been as many female engineers as there have been male engineers. But it's an important discrepancy, and I was recently chairman of the National Venture Capital Association and helped to start a diversity task force to figure out how, if we focus on it, we can accelerate the progress not just of women, but all underrepresented minorities in Silicon Valley companies, but also in the venture capital industry, which has a diversity quotient that's relatively pathetic.
What percent, people are just eager to know that when you put your bets down on all those different companies, what percent of your investments in emerging technologies and companies bear fruition, either by going public or being sold? What's kind of a rough idea?
Yeah, I mean, I talked about 1 in 10 is the company that makes your portfolio, and that's true. A more careful look at the numbers would say that somewhere between 25 and 35% of the companies that we fund, or any venture capital firm funds, go out of business and you lose all your money. Another 35% or something like that make a modest profit. And then the top 20% produce most of the returns, and a small number of them produce probably half of the total return.
There's questions having to do with our divided and sometimes cantankerous U.S. Congress, and not just in some of the subjects we've talked about, but do you have any suggestions for any lobbying that goes on that could help in whether it's clean energy or it's other technology initiatives that seem sometimes to be stymied? I mean, they even get into high-speed rail, in this country. It seems like people are against it, and there's no money at the state level, and I don't know, but the questions have to do really with the role of government and how to change that so they become a sponsor of rather than a budget limitator.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I'm leery of government getting into our industries. On the other hand, as we've noted, from a historical perspective, they've played quite an important role. And so it's something to consider with trepidation. On the other hand, there are certain policy issues that would make a tremendous difference. Again, immigration reform, high-tech immigration would be number 1, 2, and 3 on the list. This, of course, is a policy that costs nothing. Every H-1B grantee is employed by a company that on average goes on to employ 5 more people if it's a sizable company and 8 more people if it's a small company. So these are not people coming into our country taking anyone else's jobs. They're coming in and creating jobs for other people. So we absolutely need this kind of reform from a longer term. And by the way, it has the wonderful benefit of being able to fix demographics. We can't have demographics changed any other way than immigration. And so to the extent that we have shortfalls of any kind in our society, we can let people in which fill those shortfalls. From a longer term perspective, I see research investment is critical. So we talked about that earlier.
Yeah. Talking about climate change again, and this just has to do with whether you see clean energy steadily improving that. We've got still China puffing out coal and all, yet they're leading the clean energy sector with some of their companies. How do you see the increasing use of clean energy? To what extent in the next 10 or 15 years, and will that have a big effect on the climate that we are now facing?
I don't study this carefully, John. I think at a high level, it's pretty clear that no matter how quickly we're able to develop any of these alternative energies and scale up production of them, the amount of alternative energy that would then produce electricity is still going to be a very small fraction of worldwide demand. So I don't think that's necessarily going to change, the equation for the climate.
And I guess the other final question I'd like to have asked, if one person put it in a card, and that is, as you look at American power in the world, and innovation is a part of that, as is military and financial and other subjects we've covered. Do you see that you've raised some questions, but do you see overall that we still have the opportunity to remain dominant in that field, or do you see that that's absolutely difficult?
I don't think we'll be dominant, but I think we could be very important if we get it right.
Mm-hmm. If we get it right.
If we get it right.
Okay, I want to just say thank you to Scott Sandell.